Welcome back to our Bible study. I'm Steve Jarrard. We're on lesson number 9. It's January the 6th, 2011. We have been discussing the return of Christ, and in particular, we're looking at it from the vantage point of the sabbatical pattern. Now, when I talk about the sabbatical pattern, of course what happens is that we're dealing with a period of history that we're just now, in God's chronology and timeline, entering into. We talked about Hosea, that He'll raise us up on the third day, and that corresponding to Christ as the pattern, that third day is going to be very early in the morning, which is one of the reasons I anticipate the first resurrection. Now, this 1,000-year period, which I believe constitutes God's day of rest, remembering 2 Peter 3:8, that with the Lord a day is as 1,000 years, and vice versa. That opens up a whole series of questions about the millennium. Now, I've been a member of the Church of Christ for over 33 years, and I've read and studied and been to sermons. There aren't very many, very few in fact, concerning these subjects, and not a lot is taught. But I do know, as a matter of fact, that most, not every, but most Church of Christ preachers today are what we refer to as amillennial. Amillennial means they don't believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. Most Church of Christ people get this idea, this notion, as a result of what the denominational preachers of yesteryear believed. And if you start tracing some of the history about the millennium, the tribulation period, the pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib resurrection, we generally find a name in history in the early 1800s by the name of John Darby. He was a preacher in the late 1800s from England, who was part of a group called the Plymouth Brethren. And supposedly he, along with a psychotic woman, came up with this fanciful idea of a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ, and a catching up. The word rapture is associated with this doctrine, and that it's generally believed that prior to Darby, nobody believed in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. Well, we've already challenged that understanding by looking at God's heptadic pattern and realized that the Jews believed that after 6,000 years, called the Golden Age, that there would be a time of rest, that Christ would establish His kingdom. Now, one of the reasons that the Jews disqualified Jesus 2,000 years ago is because 6,000 years had not come into view. They were only 4,000 years. Now, I've erased the timeline, but you remember that I had the Red Cross at the 4,000 year mark, 2,000 at the life of Abraham, which I go into deeper when we have more time. They didn't believe Jesus could have possibly have been the Messiah because they were not anticipating Him until 6,000 years. And that was the Jewish understanding based on the way that they interpreted the recurring patterns and themes and the cycles of what they had studied and God had revealed about His timeline. So 4,000 years couldn't be Jesus. Now, when I have the time, I'd like to really address that question, because we have some other information that clearly shows that Jesus upbraided the Jews of His day, the religious leaders, always the religious leaders, common people. He he didn't expect any more from them, but from the religious leaders he certainly did. He said, you can recognize the seasons and the time and the weather and all that. He says, but you can't recognize the hour of your visitation. And why would Jesus have expected them to recognize the hour or the day of their visitation? Well, it's real plain and simple. The Jews of their day had a prophecy from Daniel chapter 9 of when Messiah was to come. They had two things to calculate. One was very simple. That was the date of the edict to rebuild Jerusalem. Now I'll go into that deeper in another study. So they had a starting date, and that was historical record. That was on record. There was no dispute about when that date came, or was, in history. And the second was that there would be 69 weeks of years. I don't have the math in front of me, but a simple mathematical calculation starting from the date to rebuild the temple after the 70 years of Babylonian captivity, Messiah would be cut off. Jesus rode in on the back of the ass, the back of the donkey, literally on the day, to the day, that this prophecy spoke of. And the Jews didn't recognize it. Now, if you remember the scriptures where God does nothing, He reveals His secret counsel through His holy prophets. God's not in the habit of doing things different. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That His MO has not changed. God has given the people who would be alive just prior to His second coming at least as much information as the Jews had pertaining to His first coming, and He held them accountable. And because they did not do their homework and they missed who He was, the city was destroyed and 1.2 million Jews died. There's going to be a similar fallout from not recognizing the sign, singular, of His coming for this day and age, and recognize that our day of visitation, the second coming of Christ, is imminent. Now, back to John Darby. So it's believed that before Darby, that the church had no concept whatsoever of there being a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Well, there's a scripture in Revelation chapter 5, verse 10, that says, "Thou hast made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth." Not in heaven. If we're going to reign with Christ, Revelation says we're going to reign here on earth. And what these modern day scholars fail to take into account and recognize is that the early church did believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. And also the ancient rabbinical teachings, as well as modern teachings, believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth following 6,000 years of history. In the ancient days, 2,000 years ago, this was known as Chiliasm. And Chiliasm, which I wrote on the board, literally means 1,000. That our early pre-Nicene church elders, bishops, they're called the church fathers, early pre-Nicene church fathers, were Chiliastic. They believed in the literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. And they wrote a lot of commentary on the subject. So let me start out with one, Justin Martyr, who was born somewhere about 100 and lived to 165. In around AD 55, he wrote a dialogue with a Jew by the name of Trypho. Quote, and Trypho, this is his writing, this is one of his letters, and Trypho replied to this, quote, I remark to you, sir, that you, speaking to and about Justin Martyr, are anxious to be safe in everything, and you cling to the Scriptures. But tell me, do you really profess that this place, Jerusalem, will be rebuilt? Of course, this was after 70 AD, after it was destroyed. And do you expect that your people will be gathered together and that they will rejoice with Christ in the company of the patriarchs and prophets, both with those of our race, the Jews, and with those who became proselytes before your Christ came, Gentiles who became Jews? Or have you proceeded to admit this in order to have the appearance of overcoming us in controversy? At this I said. So now this is Justin Martyr writing in reply. I am not such a wretched person, Trypho, that I would say other than what I think. As I admitted to you before, I and many others are of this opinion, and we believe absolutely that this will happen. But still, I signify to you that there are many Christians of pure and pious faith who do not share this belief. But I and such other Christians as judge rightly in everything believe that there will be 1,000 years in which Jerusalem will be built up, adorned, and enlarged, as the prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah and the others declared. Tertullian, who lived from 207, he wrote between 207 and 212. I don't know his birth and death date, but he was 2nd century. He writes, we confess that a kingdom has been promised to us on earth, but before heaven, and in another state of existence. It will be after the resurrection. Whew, I hope you heard that. It will be after the resurrection for 1,000 years in a divinely built city of Jerusalem, let down from heaven, which the apostle calls our mother from above, and declaring that our citizenship is in heaven. So our citizenship is in heaven, but that there will be a literal divinely built city in Jerusalem. He states thereby that it is in fact a city in heaven. This also Ezekiel knew, and the apostle John saw, which would be Revelation chapter 21. And the word of the new prophecy, which is part of our faith, attests to the foretelling that there would be as a sign an image of the city before its manifestation. One more. Lactantius, in 250 to 317, he wrote between 304 and 310. He was a writer, a teacher. He taught Constantine's son the scriptures. The son's name was Crispus. And he writes, the Son of the Most High and Mighty God will come, therefore, to judge the living and the dead. Truly, when he shall have destroyed injustice, and shall have rendered the great judgment, and shall have restored to life all the just who ever were, even from the beginning, he will remain among men for 1,000 years. And he will rule them in a most righteous reign. Those who will then be alive in the flesh will not die, but during that same 1,000 years they will generate an infinite multitude. Their offspring will be holy and dear to God. Those, however, who will be raised from the dead will preside as judges over the living. We'll pick up with a couple of more pre-Nicene fathers and their writings and close it up in our next lesson. Thank you for your attention.